So the women's Ballon d'Or was awarded to Aitana Bonmati this week, and guess what? Nobody is happy about it. My name is Claire Watkins. I am the host of The Late Sub. It is Wednesday, September 24th, and we're going to break down exactly what the Ballon d'Or is, why it matters, why it doesn't matter, what those structural flaws are, and how we can make it better for the future, because we had some wonky stuff to discuss this week. And as always in this show, we want to take a deeper dive. Let's do it. So this week, we saw the 2025 Ballon d'Or given out to Spain and Barcelona midfielder Aitana Bonmati in her third consecutive honor. She's the first player to ever win 3 Ballon d'Ors in a row. Barcelona has been cleaning these up for 5 years now. Alexia Putellas won it in 2021 and 2022. Bonmati now with the 3-year run in 2023, 24, and 25. This period of time obviously coincides with Spain's World Cup win in 2023. These are very good players who have won an immense amount of trophies since 2021. But if you've been following online, or you were watching, or you kind of have seen the commentary, that might surprise you then to hear that this decision was somewhat controversial. You saw a lot of people. I was joking about how it's rare that you can unify women's soccer fans on like both sides of the Atlantic, but you had kind of everybody up in an uproar about Bonmati winning this award in 2025. And you might wonder why. What is the Ballon d'Or? Why does it frustrate people? Bonmati had a great year, right? You know, Barcelona makes it to the Champions League final. They win the Spanish league, as they always do. And they also made it to the Euros final in 2025, losing to England in penalty kicks, right? But there is a backstory here to why the Ballon d'Or frustrates people, why it's maybe particularly frustrating from a vantage point like mine, where I live in the United States and I watch the NWSL a lot, a little bit less Eurocentric in my, watching of world soccer. And so I wanted to dig in today on what it is, why it's silly, why those European biases maybe are real. And there's a reason why non-Euro players struggle to break into the top of the awards, and maybe what can be done about it. Because as you've been following this show this year, in the ongoing push and pull between the NWSL and Europe and the US Women's National Team and these other European national teams, these perception problems are real. They're worth discussing. And I think also there's no point in complaining about them if you're not going to provide maybe a different way forward. So to kind of break it down sort of historically from a U.S. vantage point with the Ballon d'Or, no U.S. Women's National Team player has ever won the award other than Megan Rapinoe in 2019. The only other players who have actually won it at all, because this is a relatively new award on the women's side, there's Pinot, there's Alexia Putellas, Aitana Bonmati, and then in its first year, Lyon legend, Norway international player Ada Hegerberg won it in its inaugural year in 2018. Now, again, short sample size, and we'll talk about that. But the only other non-Europeans to even place in the top 3 are Sam Kerr, who has been voted both second and third in various years, and Alex Morgan, who was voted third in 2019. So US heavy year in 2019, not surprising with the World Cup, but a huge, big European bias, even when there are years with no major international tournament. This year for the US, Lindsay Heaps and Emily Fox were the only US players on the list at number 25 and 26. And then if you look at other non-Euro players, and by non-Euro, I mean they neither are from a European country or play their club football in a European country, names that you might know. Temwa Chawinga got 17th. Barbara Banda got 14th after the Orlando double last year. Marta got 12th after the Orlando double and the Copa America win this past summer. We know the Euros were this year, but there were other major international tournaments this year as well. And then the only non-European or Europe-based player on the list at all was Brazil's Amanda Gutierrez at number 21. So it's start. A lot of European players on this list. I know you'll say, yes, it was the Euros, but other soccer was played this year, and other good soccer was played this year. And I think if we're actually talking about awarding the world's top footballers, people noticed. They noticed that maybe it sort of felt like it was the world's top European footballers. And so this award, does it mostly exist to make people upset? Kinda. People, argue about this on the men's side as well. I think you probably saw the content mill working on the men's side. But let's start at the beginning. What even is the Ballon d'Or? Should we even care about it at all? And I think we'll come to that conclusion in many ways by the end of the episode. It is a European-based ceremony that for many years only gave out awards on the men's side. Like I said, there's a long history of awards here on the men's side. They only created a women's Ballon d'Or in 2018. The award used to be reflective of the calendar year, but But since 2022, on both the men and the women's side, it has been focused on what you would call the European match calendar. Specifically, like in this last year, you look at it from August to August. So what we were looking at with this period was August 2024 to August 2025. So even that shift pushes things a little bit more into the side of like we're following the European match calendar, which is that fall to spring calendar, and then the subsequent summer is what we're paying attention to. So that causes a bit of a mix and match between performance for club and country. I think a lot of times with a lot of these different awards, you have to look at the period of time when people are actually voting for. Sometimes it can feel a little bit delayed. This one is not actually. This one goes all the way up to August 2025. So if we're thinking recent performances, this actually does a decent job of that, though also, again, you talk about European bias, focus on the European match calendar. The official criteria to win a Ballon d'Or are as follows. There are 3 different notes here, 3 buckets. 1 is individual performances, decisive and impressive character. 2 is team performances and achievements. And 3 is class and fair play. So it's a wide idea. It's not exactly super clear. It leaves a lot to the voter, each individual voter, to decide what they think that means. So who are the voters? Who votes on this thing? The Ballon d'Or is presented by France Football, which I cannot emphasize enough, is a magazine. This is fundamentally presented by media. It is a magazine award in Europe, in France. Don't let the glitz and the glamour fool you. This is a little bit more limited in its voting than you might think. The short list, for example, which is the list of 30 players that the final voters get to choose from, are not actually decided. Everyone talks about the 50 countries represented on the women's side to pick your winner. The short list is all France Football and L'Équipe, which is a very good French publication that covers football widely. No shade to L'Équipe. They do a really, really nice job. But to be clear, the short list for the women is literally decided by a group of French journalists. They open it up for the final list. The preliminary round is uniquely decided by journalists working in France and specifically working for those 2 publications. I think it doesn't, I don't need to belabor the point that I'm fairly confident that those journalists do not always have the time or the resources to actually watch the necessary women's football across the globe to get this stuff right in the short listing at all. People had qualms even about just the top 30 this year or in past years. And then in the final round, which I talk about opening it up, 1 elected journalist from each of the top 50 FIFA-ranked nations votes on the final women's list. So 1 journalist from each nation is given the 30-player shortlist, and then they create a 10-player ballot in a tiered list with point designations for each ranking. If you're an American sports fan, think kind of like the way they do WNBA MVP. You have 10 players. You go first, second, third, fourth, fifth, seventh, sixth, seventh, etc. You rank them. Some people aren't going to make your list, right? But you rank them, and then those point designations are totaled, and that is how you are given the winner. So top 50 FIFA ranked nations right now in the FIFA rankings, 28 of those nations represent Europe. So there, in terms of bias, again, I am not attacking any individual journalist. It's tough out there. Everyone only has the resources to watch what they can watch. But 28 of those 50 nations are journalists representing Europe. There's no way that everyone is watching everything. There's going to be biases literally just towards what you have seen the most. And frankly, in addition to the flawed voting process where you have these French journalists who are deciding who's on the list, and then you have this kind of emphasis on European journalists to decide the top 10, it's not like the Ballon d'Or itself has proven that they care much about the women's game in general. I keep belaboring the point. The men's award has been around since 1956. The first women's Ballon d'Or was given out in 2018. And this year, they had to make some changes because even over the last couple of years, there have been some serious issues that indicate that the Ballon d'Or is kind of, I think Beth Mead a couple years ago called it box ticking. They were told, oh, you need to pay attention to the women's game and here's how you're going to do it. But there have been significant changes this year because these top footballers have made notice that it felt like they didn't even care about women's football anyway. 2025 was the first year that you had positional or offshoot awards like the Copa for Young Player, Best Goalkeeper, things like that for the women's side. Originally, they just had that top player Ballon d'Or, despite having a number of different awards for the men. You also had the ceremony was literally held during the women's international break up until this year, which they moved it after numerous high-profile complaints. So, like, for example, right, you had, Lucy Bronze calling the women's ceremony out last year, calling it a second thought due to the scheduling conflicts. Emma Hayes won Best Women's Coach last year and had to miss that award because the U.S. literally had a game that week. They were prioritizing the men's schedule over the women's schedule. They were constantly scheduling this thing during the women's international break. So yes, even if you did have a winner of the Ballon d'Or on the women's side, they weren't able to attend. You didn't have, again, that same glitz, glamour, and respect given to the women's game. And they only changed all of that this year because there was enough of a public uproar about the fact that it seemed like nobody cared about the women's side. I mean, people might remember, this actually, again, it came up on social media because people are like remembering some of these issues with the Ballon d'Or. When Hegerberg won in 2018, she came back to present the following year and she dealt with very weird vibes at that. Like, it just did not seem like players were given the respect that they deserved. It was dumb commentary surrounding and during the award ceremony. This idea that like, oh, isn't it cool? We have women here now. Go do something, silly on stage, as opposed to treating them seriously like the incredible footballers that they are. And the voting, and again, like, this is not unique to the women, but sometimes it feels worse because of the lack of resources. It does feel like a popularity contest. I started the show talking about Pinot being the only U.S. winner, but even that was a lightning rod in 2019. There were a lot of people who did not think that Pinot deserved that after it felt like more of a team award for her and that she sort of led the U.S. to the World Cup win. But in terms of individual performances, there was a very, serious argument that she was not the best player in the world that year. A lot of people thought that Vivianne Miedema should have won in leading her team to the final of the World Cup in terms of her individual performances for club and for country. So even the laziness, I'm complaining, we'll talk a little bit more about like those European biases, but I think even sometimes when the US is on top, it moves in a US direction. When the US is not on top, it moves in a different direction. Even Bon Mati's win this year drew some strange responses because of some of the people that she won over on her own team in Spain. She won over Spanish teammate Mariano Caldente, who actually scored in Arsenal's Champions League final win. Arsenal won the Champions League. Barcelona did not win the Champions League, and also put in a better performance in Spain's Euro final loss. So Bonmati had a weird win over even her own, international teammate. Also notable, obviously, there were English players who won both Champions League and the Euros in 2025 and got no better than third. Alessia Russo got third. So not taking anything away from Aitana, she is an incredible player. But everything this year felt kind of lazy and half done. Like, it's just things on top of each other, right? Whether it is the European bias, the kind of brushing off of not just US players. Those are the top, stars maybe on this show, but players in the NWSL who had incredible years, kind of this designation that like winning Copa doesn't make you deserve anything in the top 10, while also like justice for Marta, really. Like the fact that she did the double with Orlando and they win the Copa America and she's told that she's the 12th best player over the last year. It's ridiculous. But also, again, it's weird because even within the European players, they're still not getting it right. It's equal opportunity laziness in many, many ways. And that's where the Ballon d'Or represents a really frustrating dichotomy in European football, especially European women's football, both in what makes it alluring, because the ceremony is wonderful. The trophies are cool. Everyone gets dressed up. People are talking about it. I'm talking about it. Everyone in Europe's talking about it. You get that connectivity to the world of global football because this has been an award that players take seriously. And you know that because they show up. They show up on the men's side, they attend. And they show up on the women's side and they attend, and that makes it a big deal. Sometimes the perception is everything, even if it is just a handful of French journalists coming up with the shortlists. And players say they don't care about this. It's true probably that you can't win the hearts of the Ballon d'Or voters by both playing for a non-European national team and also playing in the NWSL, kind of as we've seen. The U.S. players kind of get the biggest conversation. I think Sophia Wilson is a player that people have talked about. She struggles to kind of get respect on that side. Naomi Girma, famous snub for multiple years running. Players that for whatever reason just can't get a foothold in that European consciousness. I'm very curious if Girma, I know she's had some injury issues, but if she starts playing consistently for Chelsea, be very interesting to see if that changes. Famously, again, Heaps and Fox, those are two U.S. players who play in Europe, and they made it onto the list this year in a down year for the United States, to be fair. It's a fancy party, internationally covered event, but it's built around these traditional football powers in Europe. And also, frankly, it's built around the history of the men's award and that box ticking, talking about how it feels like the women are an afterthought that proximity to what football culture is. And it's fair to say that is the men. That's decades and decades and decades. But without women having a real seat at the table, again, brings up this idea of women's football in Europe sometimes being a little bit of a house of cards. There's more investment than ever, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the societal things that it's based on sometimes feels like, yes, there's a footballing tradition, but are they making room for the women? Even Renee Slegers, Arsenal manager, in her acceptance speech for Arsenal as best club, shout out to Arsenal, great year. You know, they win Champions League. They finished top 4 in the league. She urged the powers that be in her acceptance speech to invest, to keep investing. I think it's notable that you had someone on that stage with the pinnacle, again, with the expanded awards. We have more awards for the women. Now the women can attend because it's not during an international window. But she said, invest in women, invest in women's sports. When we do that, all of us benefit. And there is something to be said that a manager with that much success, Arsenal, they play at the men's stadium. They play at the Emirates. They have succeeded in getting to the top of the mountain in Champions League. They are spending more than ever. Arsenal has shown a commitment to try to keep up with like the Chelseas of the world and the Lyons of the world in terms of the big spending kind of, player race that we're seeing, these £1 million deals that they're doing. But she's still on that stage saying, keep investing, keep, broadening your perspective of what football can be. And on the European side, that's for the women. And then from my perspective, it has to expand beyond Europe, because I resist the idea, as someone sitting here in the United States, that we have to tilt towards Europe all the time, especially in these awards where it just doesn't seem like it's worth it because it's just not that big of a voting pool. So, I'm going long on how I'm not a huge fan of the Ballon d'Or. What else is new? Shocker, right? If you listen to this show, that I don't love it. But what's the alternative, right? I think again, on this show, we've talked a lot about NWSL versus Europe and some of the infrastructural advantages that Europe has, the perception advantages that Europe has. What can be done? What can be done here so that players, not just the U.S. players, but Marta, Barbara Banda, Temwa Chawinga, that they get the respect that they deserve, because there are a lot of cultural biases against these players who are not playing in Europe. And I think the answer, going back to what Slager says, is more, longer, more programming, years and years and years of building up the prestige. And this comes in a variety of the different arms of what we consider global football to be. Whether it's making the actual Ballon d'Or better, I'm not saying chuck the Ballon d'Or in the bin, but how does that become better representative of what world football actually looks like? That has to be on the media side. Is it about different awards? Is it about extended programming for these international teams, for players who maybe are not playing for teams who are as prominent on the international side? We do now have FIFA The Best Awards, which I think is a nice mix. These lists aren't perfect either, as we know, but it is at least a mixture of media and players and coaches. And so they're doing their best with the FIFA Awards. I'm just going to call them FIFA Awards because it's confusing to say just the best over and over again. The FIFA Awards, to at least have a diversified group of voters so that you at least get closer to a consensus. Now, you don't have to agree with that consensus, and frequently I don't, but it's a little bit closer to say, yeah, everyone's getting a vote here. We're seeing what players think. We're seeing what media thinks. We're seeing what coaches think. A little bit closer to, at the very least, coming to a decision on what the larger opinion is on how these players are playing. And it is important to keep building up the programming, because I keep referring back to the U.S. players, but I don't know. The U.S. players can just keep winning as much as possible, taking overall solace from the scoreboard. And we have seen U.S. players break through if they reach the top of the mountain. Do I wish that the NWSL got more respect in terms of performances? Absolutely. Do I also concede that it's been kind of like an up and down year for the league? Also true. Is the fact that they cut off the consideration for the actual year that they're looking at mid-season a problem? Yes. The Ballon d'Or is uniquely disadvantaged for your NWSL players, but I also want there to be conversations about why these players are being ignored. It's not just the schedule. It's a couple of things. I mean, you look at Banda, who is probably one of the 10 best women's footballers in the world. Chawinga is probably even better. They're not in charge of their national team programming. They can't control what they're doing during their international breaks. And so it bugs me that it feels like their club play is not enough, when traditionally you go back to Hegerberg, her international play was not really a factor at all when she won that award in 2018. And I want that same level of respect to be extended to players who are not from Europe and do not play in European leagues. But the answer generally is, again, just more. More confederation programming. I think sometimes the confederations let their players down by not giving them the opportunity to succeed. At the federation level, what programming are you putting together for your team? What are the resources for your international team? If that is going to be really important for these players who don't play in Europe, can there be respect for the club game outside of a few European powerhouses? And then again, just like I keep advocating for this, an intellectual divestment from how things have traditionally worked in the men's game. It doesn't have to be a foregone conclusion. Now, I'm not saying that what's happening in the men's game is necessarily bad, but we're given an opportunity in women's football to take a look at how things have traditionally been done and not necessarily just sort of blindly follow the patterns that have come before us. And then my own personal pitch is kind of my last thing here. There has to be an investment in more robust media practices on the NWSL side, on the global side. You can't rely on people who it's not their entire job to watch soccer, or it's difficult for them through time zones to be able to watch the NWSL. How available is the NWSL? How available are these other leagues that you see in Europe and beyond? Whose job is it to actually sit down and watch those? If you're doing 25,000 other things, are you watching all of these? Are you able to take voting seriously? I mean, this is not unique to soccer. I think we have this conversation with like WNBA media a lot, even with the NWSL awards themselves. Who is voting on it? What resources do they have to focus on it? And do they have the contextual understanding of what they're even looking at when they watch these broadcasts? So to sum up, as I said, more, NWSL awards matter, other awards matter, more programming like the Champions Cup and CONCACAF, the Club World Cup would be, this is a fabulous addition, hopefully. It's weird that it's such a dud on the men's side, but I also think it could be really important on the women's side. I actually think it could be cool, a Club World Cup on the women's side, federation investment to keep non-Euro national teams competing with the best, and tackling structural disadvantages head on. And all of that is certainly bigger than the Ballon d'Or. But when you've got the gowns and you've got the big trophy, sometimes you see the end point and you don't totally understand how we got there. And I would love for us to kind of keep deconstructing these different ideas so that these awards, they do exist, mostly to be argued about, but at least make the argument good, because that's what women's football deserves, and that's what women's footballers deserves. So that's my piece on the Ballon d'Or. Hopefully it will continue to improve. We'll see expansion on multiple different sides, and these things do take time as well. Every single year, hopefully it gets better and better, or at the very least, we have better things to argue about. The Late Sub is part of the Just Women Sports Network. This show is written by Claire Watkins and produced and edited by Parker Fenton. To get more of your favorite women's sports content, subscribe to the Just Women Sports newsletter and follow Just Women Sports across all your favorite channels.